Good evening, everyone, and a special welcome to our distinguished speaker, Richard Gowan of the International Crisis Group. Our topic this evening is the United Nations, an institution set up to help keep the world peace, which is now, unfortunately, in a downward spiral, like world peace itself. We have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 2.5 years in. War is raging in Gaza. There's the threats of it exploding into a regional war. And there's a terrible bloodletting in Sudan and displacement of millions and millions of people. But the UN has played no meaningful role in any of these instances. Can the institution be saved so that it can do its job? Richard Gowan is the UN Director of the International Crisis Group. The Crisis Group is one of the world's leading independent think tanks with something like 170 staff around the world. They receive support from private industry, from foundations, and from governments. It tracks at any one point something like 70 conflicts around the world. And they produce what I would call astute analysis of what's gone wrong or what is about to. I have personally relied on them as a journalist on their excellent reports for years. And they're available to the public on their website, which is crisisgroup.org, crisis group, one word. Richard Gowan has worked at the UN itself in the Department of Political Affairs, and he's also dealt with international migration issues at the UN. He also worked at the European Council on Foreign Affairs. He has taught at Columbia University and at Stanford. He's a graduate of Cambridge, both as an undergraduate and in graduate studies. I give you our speaker, Richard Gowan. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Roy, and thank you to everyone. This is a good moment, in one sense, to be talking about the United Nations, but it's also a difficult moment to be talking about the UN. It's a good moment because we are on the cusp of the annual high-level meeting of the UN General Assembly, when world leaders descend on New York. That's coming up in about 3 to 4 weeks' time at the end of September. It will be notable because this will be President Biden's last opportunity to speak to other leaders at the UN. There have been rumors that President Biden might actually pass on that opportunity and that Vice President Harris could come to address presidents and prime ministers from around the world. But nonetheless, there will be a sense that this is the passing of one US administration at the United Nations. And I think that there will be a brief media flurry and media focus on the World Organization around a month from now. But it's also a difficult time to be talking about the UN because a lot of that media attention and a lot of the analysis that you will read will be very negative. The UN has just been through one of the most turbulent years in its post-Cold War history, perhaps in all of its history. We've had continued debates in the Security Council, as Roy said, over the situation in Ukraine. Those debates have often been very, very fierce. And the Security Council has not been able to do anything to help the Ukrainians because Russia is there with a veto. Even more acutely, we have seen very, very vehement debates amongst UN member states about the war between Israel and Hamas and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And I would say that the war in Gaza has really struck home to a lot of diplomats based in New York. And they have taken this crisis very, very personally. It's something which has really caused great distress around the organization. And in addition to that, we have crises in places like Haiti, wars in places like Sudan and Myanmar that are all on the UN agenda. But as Roy said, the UN is struggling to deal with. And so I think that if you follow the UN, even if you only follow it sporadically, you will share the sense that Roy described, that this is an organization that is certainly not living up to the goals of the UN Charter, agreed at the end of the Second World War, and perhaps an organization, yes, in a downward spiral and in a very deep crisis. So what's going on? What I'm going to try to do over the next half hour or so is look at some of the really fundamental problems that we see at the UN, some of the issues that are eating away at the foundations of the organization. And those include security issues, they include geopolitical issues, but they also include issues relating to economic development and the fight against climate change. And I'm going to try and lay out what I think are some of the main forces challenging the UN today. I'm then going to talk about some ongoing efforts to try and improve the institution, because there are quite serious current discussions about how to reform the UN and how to make the organization fit for purpose once again. Actually, at the end of September, on the 22nd of the month, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is hosting what he's calling a Summit of the Future, which is meant to be a special opportunity for world leaders to talk about how to reform multilateralism and how to overhaul bodies like the Security Council. And so I'm going to look at whether there is any real opportunity to stop the rot and strengthen the UN after a very difficult period. I'm afraid, spoiler alert, that my predictions are not going to be immensely positive. I don't think that we are at a moment where global politics allows us to really rejuvenate the UN and really get the UN back on track. But I do think it's important to recognize that there are efforts to push the organization in the right direction. And then I'm going to close with a few thoughts about what we should really prioritize at the UN in such a difficult period, and how I think this organization, an organization which I've worked on for 2 decades, can still have value, even in a period of international fragmentation and international competition. And I'm not going to offer a utopian vision of international cooperation. I'm actually going to emphasize a few areas, deeply important areas like avoiding major power war and dealing with extreme poverty, where I think the UN can still make a real contribution to the world today. But I do that from a very realistic understanding of the weaknesses of the organization. And I'm going to start by laying out those weaknesses. Okay, so what is going wrong? Well, I would emphasize, I think, 4 fundamental challenges to the UN today. One of them is the return of competition as the defining characteristic of relations between states, including the major powers. The second is the failure of the UN to achieve some of its goals for international development that are incredibly important to many countries in what we now call the Global South. The third challenge is the failure of UN diplomacy to really get a grip on global warming, and the failure of UN conferences to deal with climate change, which I think is also undermining the credibility of the institution. And then the fourth negative theme is that the UN is simply an organization that can feel a little stuck in the past. It's an organization that doesn't have the frameworks we need to deal with new challenges like the rise of artificial intelligence. And I'll go through all of those problems, and then I will turn to how the UN is trying to overcome the problems. Let's start with competition. The UN as we know it today, the UN that we've lived with for the last 35 years or so, has been able to work imperfectly, but nonetheless quite well in dealing with a lot of crises because we have been in an era of international cooperation. If you look at the history of the UN, from its foundation in the 1940s to the late 1980s, the organization was very limited and often paralyzed because in the context of the Cold War and the Soviet-US split, there were not very many opportunities for multilateral cooperation through New York. There were some opportunities. There were moments where UN peacekeeping forces played important roles, for example, in the 1956 Suez Crisis, but those only came once every few years, and the institution never lived up to the dream of its original founders, including President Roosevelt, in the early decades. That changed with the end of the Cold War, and especially in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and into the first decade of this century, the major powers, including the US, Russia, and China, as a rule, tended to come to the UN to cooperate on crisis management. And the characteristic of that time was that Moscow, Beijing, Washington were often willing to work through the United Nations. Now, clearly, that cooperation sometimes went badly off the rails. If you look at the Balkans in the 1990s or Rwanda in 1994, the UN failed to respond to huge humanitarian crises. Similarly, UN cooperation broke down in a very, very brutal fashion in 2003 over Iraq. But nonetheless, after those breakdowns, after those crises, the major powers and smaller powers, including European nations, tended to come back to the UN and say, we have to work together. We need to cooperate. But I think that what we've seen since about 2011 and the beginning of the Arab revolutions is that tendency to cooperate, that desire to work through the UN, has gradually been waning away. We saw this over many years in the case of the civil war in Syria, where Russia and China blocked effective UN action. And we've seen it in a much more intense fashion in the last couple of years over Ukraine and now over Gaza. There is a deep lack of trust, frankly, amongst the major players at the UN now, and they do not see it as in their interests to work through a cooperative structure like the United Nations. Now, this isn't necessarily the fault of the UN. There are a lot of people who will tell you that, oh, the Security Council doesn't work because its rules are structured in a certain way. I don't think that's right. I think that what is undermining the UN is actually much deeper, and it is the broader decline in relations between powers, and especially the broader decline in relations between Russia, the US, and China. But the UN is an organization that rests on the desire of countries to cooperate. The UN does not have an independent power to enforce cooperation. And so as we've entered a world of competition, we have seen the UN respond less and less effectively to more and more crises. And that's not just Ukraine, it's not just Gaza. In the last 3 years alone, we have seen the UN do very little over the war in Myanmar, do almost nothing over the civil war in Ethiopia, which claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and probably actually claimed more lives than the wars in Ukraine and Gaza combined. And now we're seeing the UN doing very, very little over the war in Sudan, which Roy referred to. And in each of those cases, if you go behind the curtain and if you ignore some of the diplomatic language, what you will find is that the big powers at the UN, the veto powers in the Security Council, are failing to cooperate, and they're following logics of competition. They're seeing these wars as opportunities to challenge one another or promote their national interests, rather than work together to get a peaceful solution. So, I mean, I think this is what is going wrong in the Security Council. This is what you see in the headlines most of the time. And the fact that the UN is struggling to deal with so many crises is reducing the confidence of many nations around the world in multilateral security and in the UN as a security provider. If you're sitting in Poland, where I was last week on vacation, you don't trust the UN to protect you against Russia because you've seen that the UN was not able to protect Ukraine. Equally, one trend that we see right now is that a lot of African nations that might 10 or 15 years ago have turned to the UN for support through peacekeeping forces or through sanctions, now view the UN with distrust because they don't actually believe that this organization is going to help them. And then if you turn to the Middle East, a region where the organization has been involved since the late 1940s, it's very hard to find anyone who trusts the UN at all. The government of Israel has been very clear in rejecting the UN and criticizing the UN's response to the atrocities by Hamas last October. The Israeli government has actually called on the UN Secretary General to resign over his response to the war. But on the other hand, a lot of Arab observers and a lot of Arab citizens are also incredibly unhappy with the UN because they believe the organization has failed to protect the people of Gaza. And actually, last December, there was quite a lot of discussion about the risks of attacks by just regular Arab citizens on UN compounds because the level of anger with the organization was so high. So we are in a period where there is a real loss of faith in the UN's ability to act, and that is rooted, I think, in the shift in the nature of global politics. And it's a shift in the nature of global politics which hamstrings the UN. But moving on to my second theme, that isn't the only issue that frustrates UN member states, and it isn't the only issue that is the source of contention in New York and in other UN centers like Geneva. There's also a good deal of frustration with how the organization is pursuing the goal of international development. And actually, in many parts of the world, the UN is judged less by its role in peace and security and more by its contributions to the fight against extreme poverty and the promotion of economic growth. In many parts of the global south, that is what the UN's primary brand is. But again, the UN doesn't seem to be delivering on a lot of its promises in this area. Back in 2015, there was another big conference here in New York, and the UN endorsed the Sustainable Development Goals, a very, very ambitious set of economic targets for the world to fulfill by 2030. And these Sustainable Development Goals included a great raft of promises, but they centered on promises such as eradicating extreme poverty worldwide by the end of the current decade. And in 2015, that felt like a seminal moment. That did actually feel like a historical moment in terms of international development, because you had everyone coming together, the Obama administration, China, and others, and saying, we are going to work together to end poverty in a framework defined by the United Nations. That was a moment of hope. And actually, if you track economic data from about 2015 to 2020, it really did seem as if the world might be able to live up to at least some of the key promises in the Sustainable Development Goals. Between 2015 and 2019, extreme poverty was reduced by 25% roughly worldwide. It did seem that this UN-endorsed framework for economic growth could lift the most vulnerable out of destitution. But then in 2020, COVID came, and COVID was a profoundly divisive moment within the UN organization, because a lot of developing countries felt that the US and Europeans deserted them and didn't provide them economic assistance or medical assistance during a crisis which then did huge damage to their economies. And then the war between Russia and Ukraine came and did further damage to the global economy because it drove food shocks and energy shocks. And the net result of these two huge and unexpected crises is that the world is now very, very far off track in terms of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN set itself nearly 10 years ago. We're actually seeing extreme poverty rising in some parts of the world. And we're seeing a lot of countries really struggling to even pay the interest on their debts. And the net result of this is that if you talk to diplomats from Africa, if you talk to diplomats from other less developed economically parts of the world, they will tell you, we are feeling let down by the UN because you're not responding to the basic economic needs of our people. Something that I've seen quite a lot over the last 2 years is that European officials will come to New York and they will say, the UN is failing Ukraine. The UN is not living up to its charter obligations over Ukraine. And the response they will get from African interlocutors or interlocutors from Asia is, yes, we recognize that, but the UN is also failing us over development. And so actually, the West is unhappy with the UN for one set of reasons, but the global South is also unhappy with the UN because it feels that it's not getting what it expects out of this organization. So everyone is rather unhappy. And then to add to that unhappiness, there is a real sense that another set of goals that were set in 2015 are slipping away. And those are the goals which world leaders approved in Paris in 2015 to limit global warming and to hold global warming to somewhere around 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. Again, if you go back to 2015, the Paris Pact felt like a real breakthrough for multilateralism. It felt like a real breakthrough for UN diplomacy. The Obama administration worked very intelligently with China behind the scenes to get agreement on these climate targets. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon worked enormously hard to deliver on the climate deal. But again, what we've seen over the last decade is that although there has been some progress on limiting global warming, it simply isn't sufficient to meet the UN goals. We're seeing the effects of climate change accelerating with floods in places like Pakistan. And again, if you come to the UN and if you find diplomats from small island states in the Pacific, they will tell you that what they are really unhappy about is the fact that their countries are sinking and the fact that their countries are facing existential crises because global warming is driving up sea levels. And for some states, that literally means that their existence is in peril. And so those diplomats say, again, we understand the anger over Ukraine, we understand the anger over Gaza, but for us, the great failure of the UN has been that it has not provided a serious diplomatic mechanism to deal with climate change. And so, this is not a pretty picture, and it's not a pretty picture wherever you're looking at it from any part of the world. There's also, and I won't go into this in great detail, there's also a lot of nervousness around the organization that the institution is stuck in the past. Diplomats read the newspapers, they read the internet, they are very aware, as we're all very aware, that the world of science is moving at extremely high speed. They can see that new technologies like artificial intelligence are going to reshape the global economy and reshape international relations in the coming years. But when they look at the UN, they don't see the frameworks that might be needed to promote international cooperation around artificial intelligence. They don't see the treaties that we need to deal with challenges like the rise of lethal autonomous weapon systems, otherwise known as killer robots. They see an organization that is stuck in the past, with different agencies that were mainly formed in the 1960s or perhaps in the 1990s. And they wonder about a disconnect between this institution and the very fast-moving world that we're living in. And so just to add to the general level of concern about multilateralism, there is a question about whether the UN can keep up with the pace of scientific change that is defining our world and will define our life together in future. So those are all the problems that are on the table here in New York. I'm sure I could add to them, and in the Q&A, I'll be very, very happy to go into other issues facing the UN, of which there are many. But it does raise the question, as Lenin put it in a different circumstance, what is to be done? Is there some way to face up to all the challenges that we're facing and find some sort of breakthrough to restore credibility to the United Nations organization? And this is actually something which has been a topic of diplomatic discussion in New York since 2021, and is going to be a particular focus, as I mentioned earlier, at the end of September, when Secretary General Guterres will convene a special event called the Summit of the Future. Now, the context for this is that Antonio Guterres, who has been the UN Secretary General since 2017, is acutely aware of all the problems I have just described. Guterres has led the UN for 7 years, but he's actually one of the organization's most astute and most consistent critics. And he knows about the weaknesses that we have been talking about. And he's actually profoundly concerned about the future of multilateral cooperation. And so in 2021, he published a big report called Our Common Agenda, where he essentially listed a lot of the problems that I've been discussing and said, we can't just live with the status quo. We can't just accept a weak international system. We need to get together, and we need world leaders to get together to reform the UN and to make this organization fit for purpose. And Guterres himself, I think, took a lot of lessons from the pandemic. I think he was very depressed by the fact that the UN didn't feel very relevant to the management of COVID-19. And he's also fascinated by some of the other topics I alluded to, such as the need for new multilateral systems to deal with technological advances like AI. So he put this all on the table, and he invited leaders to gather in New York this September and look at old institutions like the UN Security Council and see if they could be overhauled, but also to talk about whether we need completely new institutions to deal with completely new problems. He suggested, for example, setting up an international agency that could govern artificial intelligence, or at least promote coordination about artificial intelligence. And this was quite a brave thing to do. It was quite a brave thing for the leader of the UN to say, I know the systems we have are not up to facing the world we have today. Can we imagine a radical overhaul of the institution? And I think it's to his credit that he put this challenge on the table. Unfortunately, what we have seen over the last 3 years is not, to put it mildly, governments around the world coming together to think through how to improve international cooperation. What we've actually seen is a continued fragmentation of the international system. As I said, Guterres proposed the summit in 2021. Well, obviously, within 6 months of that, you had Russia's all-out aggression against Ukraine. More recently, you've had Gaza. And the debates over that and the ill will over all these crises have made it awfully, awfully difficult for the UN's 193 members to discuss seriously how to respond to the challenge that Guterres set them about the need to cooperate on resolving global problems. And so, rather unfortunately, what we have seen over the last couple of years is a diplomatic discussion about the Summit of the Future that has drifted away from the high ambitions of the UN Secretary General and has tended to get bogged down in arguments over draft UN documents, minor details, and has just been characterized by a certain lack of trust and a certain lack of ambition. What will come out of the Summit of the Future when it eventually happens a few weeks from now? It will make some progress on some issues. There is a document that is still being worked on called the Pact for the Future. And the Pact for the Future will contain quite a lot of good consensus language on the need to help poorer countries deal with issues like international debt and promote international development. This summit is not going to result in big binding promises of cash for international development, but it will set a positive direction for dealing with some of those problems. It will contain some vaguer language about the need for cooperation on issues like AI too, but it's also going to have some fairly obvious holes. It hasn't been possible for UN members to come up with any real answers for the problems we've seen in the Security Council, and the language that the pact will contain on international security issues will ultimately be quite thin. Diplomats say that the best they really hope for is a document that will be agreed by consensus, that at least shows there is some desire amongst UN member states to keep cooperating, that UN members can work together when they want to, but it's a much, much lower level of ambition than the level of ambition that Guterres laid out just a few years ago. And I think it's a testament, sadly, to the weaknesses, not only of the UN, but also the limits to international cooperation that we see globally today, that we're going to come out with such a limited set of reform proposals for the UN. I'll be happy to go into the specifics of the UN reform proposals in more detail if you want in the Q&A. But as I say, we're going to have a summit of the future that is not really going to live up to its rather grand title. So where does that leave us? You know, if I had $1 for every time someone came to me and said, "Is the UN about to collapse?" I would be a reasonably rich man. There is a real sense, even amongst some people working in the organization, that the problems I'm describing are terminal. And you will find people who look at this situation and draw parallels with what happened in the 1930s to the UN's predecessor, the League of Nations, which famously stalled and then crumbled as Europe and Asia stumbled towards the Second World War. A lot of people do look at the UN now and say maybe it has some of the same symptoms. In an era of great power competition, in an era of global division, maybe this is an institution that is, ultimately doomed. I have to say that I think that analysis is too stark and probably too pessimistic. I think that although the UN is suffering from all the problems that I've described, there are still many areas where all countries, including China and Russia, agree that multilateral cooperation is necessary. Even on some security issues, we see that these very divided powers are able to come together and propose solutions to the problems that they share. So interestingly, one area where the UN has continued to work reasonably well since 2021, at least in terms of diplomatic cooperation, has been Afghanistan. After the collapse of Kabul, the US and other powers basically turned to the UN and said, Afghanistan is your problem. You need to keep on getting humanitarian aid into Afghanistan. And the UN has continued to do that despite enormous questions about the morality of working with the Taliban, and it has continued to have the support of China and Russia and the US in doing so. Even today, to take another example, the Security Council agreed unanimously to update the mandate for UN peacekeepers in southern Lebanon, because there's an agreement amongst these very divided countries that it's still better to have the UN in southern Lebanon acting as some sort of buffer between Israel and Hezbollah than to pull the peacekeepers out and allow the crisis in the Middle East to spiral further. And so we do see that even in this moment of great strain, the big powers can come to the Security Council, can come to the UN, and can make some basic agreements on issues where their interests more or less overlap. And if you look beyond the security realm, you will find that there are still many areas where multilateral cooperation is unavoidable. We still live in a world where we have a high degree of economic interdependence. We have diseases that cross borders, ignoring the existence of those borders. And there is a recognition amongst all states, despite their differences, that you do need global organizations to deal with these global problems. And so in technical organizations in Geneva or Vienna, away from the drama of the Security Council, you still have a fairly high degree of international cooperation continuing through the UN. And I don't think that there's any power now that simply wants this entire international system to implode. Even if China and the US have very different visions of the United Nations, even if China in particular would like to challenge US leadership in the United Nations, China is not going to pull down the UN system because China does see the advantage of international cooperation. So my instinct is that the UN is very hard to reform. The UN is not living up to the promises of the UN Charter, but the UN is not going to go away. It is still necessary. But diplomacy at the UN is going to get very, very difficult for all the reasons that I'm describing. And that, the problems I'm describing are not going to go away either. And so multilateral cooperation is going to be a very, very thorny craft for the foreseeable future. Just so to end then, what do I think that we should be looking towards the UN to do? I think I've laid out fairly clear why this is not an organization that is going to step up and solve all the world's problems, but that raises a question about what problems can the organization still solve. I think that I would still point to a couple of areas where I believe that the UN has a high degree of value. And I'll just go through a few of them quickly. As I said at the beginning, from a very pragmatic standpoint. The first of these is relates to the problem that I set out at the outset, which is the high degree of international competition that we face today. As I've described, the high degree of international competition means that we can't expect the UN to solve problems like Russia's aggression against Ukraine. But actually, precisely because it is such a competitive and tense environment, it is important that we keep the UN, and specifically the Security Council, as a space where China, Russia, the US, and other powers can engage, can meet, can do direct diplomacy, and where possible, find ways to reduce tensions, to deconflict, and even identify cases, such as Afghanistan and Lebanon, where they see a continued shared interest in cooperation. I think that the Security Council may end up being a very tense but nonetheless important space for residual compromise in a very divided system. Now, that's not the Security Council of the 1990s. That's not the Security Council that believers in the UN want to see. But I think it's an important role for the UN in reducing tensions in a period of heightened international friction. Secondly, when we turn to development, I don't think that the UN can give up or should give up on the core challenge that was set in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the fight against extreme poverty. Economists such as Martin Wolf, who writes for the Financial Times, have highlighted the fact that we are seeing backsliding on extreme poverty levels worldwide. But they've also emphasized that with a solid degree of international cooperation, it should be possible, even if behind schedule, to eradicate extreme poverty. And I think that the UN still remains important as a development actor and as a framework for international economic assistance in the world's poorest countries. The UN's economic offer is not relevant to a middle-income country such as Indonesia or countries in Latin America today. But the UN's economic tools and the UN's economic development support, when combined with other organizations like the World Bank, really can still play a crucial role in ending extreme poverty in countries in Africa in particular, and other least developed countries. And in a period where, despite all their differences, a lot of major donors want to maintain good relations with the countries of the Global South, I think the fight against extreme poverty can still be a rallying cause in the United Nations. And then as an adjunct to that, I think it's also important to remember an issue which I haven't raised so far, which is that the UN continues to play a unique and unrivaled role in providing humanitarian aid in war zones and countries affected by natural disasters. I talked about how the UN is often functioning even when the Security Council is stuck. Well, often the bits of the UN that are most functional are agencies like the World Food Programme, which provides essential food aid in countries such as Sudan, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and other UN aid agencies. And in a period where we're seeing a rise in global conflict, in a period when we're seeing a rise in natural disasters associated with climate change, I think those UN agencies are going to be out on the front line a lot, again, helping the most vulnerable. And so the UN has a role not only in promoting economic development, but in channeling humanitarian aid to those who need it most. But again, I should make a warning, because the humanitarian agencies are currently struggling with huge budget shortfalls. The UN estimates that it needs about $48 billion to deal with all the humanitarian crises around the world this year. So far in 2024, it's got roughly a quarter of that, somewhere just over $10 billion in funds from donor countries. So the UN has an essential role to play in helping the neediest, but it also needs more financial support to achieve that goal. But these are the areas where I think we will find ourselves continuing to turn to the UN. Major power deconfliction, fighting extreme poverty, fighting humanitarian crises. And these are the hard work that I think we should continue to ask the UN to do, and where we should invest in the UN going forward. I'll end with a quote that many of you will have heard. It's a quote that crops up a lot in discussions of the United Nations, and it's a quote that's attributed to the second Secretary General of the organization, a Swede called Dag Hammarskjöld. And Hammarskjöld, who was a very, very fine diplomat, is reported to have said that the UN is not here to lead mankind to heaven. It is here to save mankind from hell. And I think that in a period of international fragmentation, in a period of international competition, sometimes focusing on the avoiding hell bit is quite important. And I think that the UN does still have a role, as I say, not only in helping countries avoid escalating into worse crises, but also in helping some of the most vulnerable people around the world. And that is an honorable role, even if it's not quite the high, ambitious vision of the UN that we might have entertained 25 or 30 years ago. So not a massively optimistic note to end on, but hopefully not the most pessimistic one that I could have offered you. Thank you.
Richard, thank you so much. It's a pretty somber picture you draw. It's fascinating, for one thing, that you are taking in the whole world and all of its problems and suggesting the UN is still useful in, highly useful in some areas, if it gets support. Obviously, the United States is a prime member. It plays an outsized role at the UN, indispensable in many cases, often constructive, sometimes obstructionist, and not always consistent. But of course, the U.S. is right now in the throes of its own political choice for the future. How much does the outcome of the American race affect the ability of the UN to maybe to reform or to rethink its role or add to its role? I mean, the two candidates seem to have different perspectives. This is an understatement.
To put it mildly, yeah, I mean, look, I can assure you that if you sit down with diplomats in New York, we talk about all these problems, but it's very, very hard to get to the end of the conversation with someone saying, but what about the US election? It's on everyone's mind. It's been on everyone's mind for some time now. Obviously, the UN has experience of living with President Trump, and I think that we know that a second Trump administration would be very challenging for the organization. Just as in his first term, Trump would probably pull the United States out of quite a lot of UN agreements, like the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and quite a lot of UN institutions, like the Human Rights Council in Geneva. I mean, he's done that all before. And I think there's also a real worry that a Republican administration, in coordination with the Republican Congress, would really shrink US contributions to the UN budget. There has been a lot of anger in Congress, on both sides of the aisle, but especially on the Republican side, about UN criticisms of Israel over the war against Hamas, and we've heard quite a lot of Republican figures, including Mitt Romney, for example, talking about the need to severely reduce US funding to the UN. So I think that if we get a second Trump administration, we would expect to see the US distancing itself from many parts of the organization and significantly reducing financing to many parts of the organization. And because the US remains, by some way, the most important financial contributor to the UN, that would be very, very painful indeed. In addition, I think we would expect another Trump administration to have a very aggressive posture towards China in the Security Council in particular, and that would make it harder for the Council to play even the sort of limited international deconfliction role that I was talking about. We have less of an understanding of what a Harris administration would do because we've had less time to think about it. It's worth saying that the Biden administration's relations with the UN have not been entirely easy. Actually, interestingly, Secretary General Guterres had a better personal relations with Trump, who he got to know unexpectedly quite well, than he has had with Biden. He has not developed a personal relationship with Biden. And clearly there has been a lot of friction over the last year between Washington and New York over Gaza. Nonetheless, the Biden administration, as a rule, has been more favorable towards the UN. It rejoined agreements like the Paris Climate Agreement. I think we would expect President Harris, if we get President Harris, to continue on in that broad direction. We would expect another Democratic administration to be generally favorable towards the UN. But I think we also have to be realistic that even a pro-UN Democratic administration has a lot of other issues on its plate. And the priority in Washington would remain competition with China rather than promoting multilateral agreements. If you talk to diplomats here, there is often a particular nostalgia for the second Obama administration. And it was in the second Obama administration that the UN got the Paris deal, got the JCPOA, got the Iranian nuclear deal. Sorry, the US got the Iranian nuclear deal, that we had the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a feeling that Obama 2 was a high watermark in US-UN relations. A Harris administration probably wouldn't go all the way back there, but a Trump administration would take us a lot further away.
That goes to a question that Robbie Harris, the chairman of our board, is asking. Is the United States now currently meeting its financial commitments to the UN? He also asks, and this is not directly related, what about Haiti? Why has the UN not figured out what to do about Haiti? And I realize there were efforts some years ago, which the Trump administration walked away from. But Haiti is maybe the biggest single problem in the hemisphere. And it would seem like a multilateral approach might be the best way to deal with it.
So firstly, on the funding issue, the US is behind on paying its dues to the UN, and that is in part because of problems in Congress. It's very hard to get the money that the administration has earmarked for the UN out of Washington because of the level of congressional dysfunction. That is already making life quite difficult for UN officials. Just on a day-to-day basis, cash flow is short because you don't have the float of US money. At one point this year, Guterres was saying that the UN might run out of money completely by September unless the US and some other major donors stepped up. I think that risk has been avoided. but it is a serious problem, and it is sort of related to American politics. I think what Guterres and other UN officials fear is that a second Trump administration would not merely be slow in paying its dues, but would actually, as a matter of policy, not pay its dues. And that would sort of have a very, very severe financial effect on the organization. I would add there is one particular UN agency, UNRWA, the agency that provides assistance to Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere, which has sort of seen all its US funding dry up in the last 12 months because of allegations that UNRWA staff were complicit with Hamas on the 7th of October. That again is causing the UN absolute financial nightmares because it simply doesn't have the cash to provide the aid that it's trying to Palestinians both in Gaza but also in other areas like the West Bank. So the US financial issue really, really matters. It's quite telling actually just on Gaza that even countries like Sierra Leone and Armenia have been stepping up with funding for UNRWA because there's a sort of a great sense that it's essential to get help to the Palestinians. But clearly Sierra Leone is not going to find the money that the US is withholding. So this is a budget crisis. On Haiti, this is a very long story, and I'm not going to tell you all of it. But the UN has been involved in Haiti since the 1990s. There have been a series of UN peacekeeping forces deployed to Haiti to deal with periods of disorder really throughout the post-Cold War period. And each of those peacekeeping forces has had short-term success, but none of them has succeeded in really establishing the basis for long-term law and order in Haiti. Now, the last UN peacekeeping force left Haiti, I would say, about 5 years ago. And in the years that followed, we saw another breakdown. We have seen gangs taking over Port-au-Prince. The prime minister was assassinated. And you would think that the UN would look at this situation and say, okay, this is one of those cases where geopolitics are not that important. We're going to send peacekeepers back in. However, the UN has not done that for a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is actually to do with the history of the UN in Haiti. Sadly, a lot of the previous peacekeeping forces had very bad track records of sexual abuse. And there are a lot of very well proven stories of UN peacekeepers in Haiti exploiting women and girls sexually. And that means that the UN is not popular in Port-au-Prince. And then I think perhaps even more horrifically, a UN peacekeeping unit from South Asia in about 2013, I think, appears to have brought cholera into the country. And Haiti has been dealing with a cholera crisis ever since. And the UN has never 100% admitted responsibility for this. But for many Haitians, it's axiomatic that it was the UN that brought this disease into their nation. And so about 18 months ago, when it became clear that Haiti was once again on the brink of a huge crisis, the message from Antonio Guterres was, the world needs to do something, we probably need to intervene, but we don't actually think the UN can go back into Haiti because its credibility in the country is so low. Now, since then, there's been a great search for someone who could lead an international intervention into Haiti. The US wanted Canada to do it. Canada said, thanks, but no thanks. This looks pretty dangerous. It actually ended up being Kenya, who stepped up, and Kenyan said that in the spirit of solidarity with the Haitians, and also because Kenya is developing security relations with the US, it would send police into Haiti. And just within the last couple of months, Kenyan police have started to arrive in Port-au-Prince. They have started to do patrols. They've exchanged fire with gang members on at least one occasion. They've taken casualties. And so we do now have an international force back in Haiti, but it's very small. There's still only a few hundred individuals, whereas the last UN peacekeeping force was over 8,000 troops, including some pretty effective Brazilian Marines. So the UN is underperforming in Haiti, but for quite specific reasons. That said, just to show how the geopolitics gets everywhere, there's also a problem with China over Haiti. China is not minded to offer a lot of support to the Haitians because the Haitians retain diplomatic ties to Taiwan. And this means that all the discussions about what to do with Haiti in the last 18 months have been complicated by tensions between the US and China over the Taiwan topic, even though we're talking about an issue in the Caribbean.
Wow. So one of the big issues of UN reform is who are the members of the Security Council, the permanent members of the Security Council who have a veto. And obviously, India does not, and nor does Japan, and they've been proposed by various people over quite a long time. And I gather it's China again that is opposing both of those. Is there any way to overcome that? And would that actually solve anything were the Security Council to be enlarged with either more countries with a veto or fewer countries with a veto?
So almost everyone agrees that the Security Council, as it's currently set up, is anachronistic. I mean, you have a body where the 5 primary victors of the Second World War continue to have veto power and continue to have outsized influence in the UN. And, just to take an example, for many African members of the UN, it's very uncomfortable to have former colonial powers like France and the UK still playing a central role in UN debates over their security. So there's a very widespread feeling that we need Security Council reform, and that has been intensified 1,000% by first Russia's use of its veto to deflect criticism of its actions in Ukraine, and then, if we're honest, by the US use of its veto to deflect criticisms of Israel over Gaza. So everyone wants Security Council reform. The problem is that no one can agree what Security Council reform would look like. And you do have 4 countries, India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan, who say that their economic weight and their global weight means that they should have permanent seats on the Security Council. But for every one of those countries, there's at least one other state, usually more, that is very strongly opposed to them getting that privilege. So the Spanish-speaking countries of Latin America, like Mexico or Argentina, do not want to see Brazil suddenly having a veto in New York. In Europe, Spain and Italy are very opposed to Germany getting this privilege. But I think the key issue is Asia, because China is absolutely allergic to the idea of Japan becoming a permanent member of the Security Council for historical reasons, and very, very negative about the idea of India becoming a permanent member, because obviously it's in China's interest to be the only Asian country with a veto at the UN. And so there has been a great deal of discussion of Security Council reform in recent years. President Biden actually said in 2022 that the US wanted to see Security Council reform. The State Department did quite a lot of fairly serious homework talking to other countries about whether this was possible. But at the end of the day, the blockers, the opponents of promoting India or promoting Brazil have stood their ground. And so at the Summit of the Future, in the Pact of the Future, you're not going to see real substantive progress towards Security Council reform. And Indian diplomats in particular are livid about this, and see this as just one more failure of the UN to recognize their country's size and their weight. So, I mean, I've worked on UN reform, UN Security Council reform, specifically for over 10 years. I would like that part of my life back because it's deeply frustrating. And I'm afraid to say that I'm probably going to end up working on it for another 10 years yet, or maybe even longer, because reform remains quite far off. The other question you ask is telling. Would it make a difference? Do we believe that the Security Council would be more effective if you had India and Brazil sitting inside it with vetoes as permanent members? I think that's very questionable. I mean, the US was very frustrated with India in 2022 and 2022 in particular, because India was a temporary member, an elected member of the Security Council that year, but refused to condemn Russia over Ukraine. And so there are some in the US system who will say, we don't actually think India would really contribute to a more effective Security Council. I have to say, I think, though, that the real question is about the legitimacy of this organization. And I mean, you can hear that you've probably noticed that I'm a Brit. I'm an Englishman abroad, an Englishman in New York, like Sting. But I have to say that, speaking as an Englishman, I do find it pretty absurd that my country has a veto in the Security Council and India, with 1 billion inhabitants, does not. And the longer this sort of historic lack of equity lasts, the less, just the less legitimacy and credibility the council will have.
We have a question from Peyton Davis, who is currently an intern at the Baltimore Council. She's a Bryn Mawr student, expert on Turkish issues. She asked the question, and this maybe follows on from everything you've said. What are your thoughts about how to facilitate cooperation between nations when multilateralism does not serve their own interests? Or do you think that multilateralism is always in everybody's interest? In other words, there have been proposals to create other organizations. I think Liz Truss, former British Prime Minister, at one point suggested taking an existing forum like the G7 and turning it into a mini UN. But leave aside that proposal. Is multilateralism passé? I'm not sure what the alternative is.
I hadn't marked you down as a Liz Truss fan, Roy, but I guess there are still a few Truss fans out there. Look, there's no shortage of proposals, and there's one continuing theme, and actually what Truss talks about is a version of this, is the idea that maybe in a more divided world, what you need is for democracies, or maybe just Western democracies, to not leave the UN, but to step away from the UN and essentially work through bodies like the G7, which are like-minded, democratic, US-leaning. I think we are seeing some steps in that direction. I think that since Russia's all-out aggression against Ukraine, we've seen a revitalization of NATO. We've seen a revitalization of the G7. We have seen, the Biden administration, I think, investing more politically in some small groups like the Quad in the Asia Pacific, with India, Japan, and Australia. And in a period where a body like the UN is often stuck, often unable to answer questions, it's very natural to turn to these smaller, more like-minded clubs as alternatives to try and fix problems. I think we're also seeing some of the US rivals, or countries that are skeptical of US leadership, pulling in the other direction. China in 2023 engineered an expansion of the BRICS, And although the BRICS grouping is very, very shaky, very fragile, it is clear that quite a lot of big non-Western countries would like to see the BRICS emerging as some sort of counterweight to the G7, although I think more in financial affairs than in security affairs. And, you know, you have some countries that are stuck straddling these groups. I mean, India is both inside the BRICS with China, but then it's also in the Quad courting the US. What all this points to is a diffusion of cooperation away from universal bodies like the UN towards smaller like-minded clubs. I think we also see that to a degree in Africa, where despite a lot of problems, the African Union is taking more of a leading role in some crises than it did 10 years ago. And for some African countries, the AU is clearly a preferable vehicle to the UN. Nonetheless, for all that, I do think it's incredibly important to say that firstly, in a divided world, you do need spaces where countries that don't like each other can still talk to each other. And that's what the UN provides par excellence. The UN is still one of the very few spaces where Ukrainian and Russian diplomats can speak to each other in public, and they frequently do. And as I said, the UN is also a space where China and Russia and the US can still find compromises over cases like Afghanistan and Lebanon. Similarly, it's only the UN that has the humanitarian frameworks and agencies like the World Food Programme that you need to deal with very large-scale humanitarian crises. So I think what we're probably entering into is a world where countries by preference work through bodies like the G7 and the BRICS, but by default return to the UN to deal with the issues that like-minded clubs cannot deal with on their own.
Well, I hate to wrap this up because I think that the discussion is fascinating. I have more questions from several members, Arnold Sherman, Charles Bloomquist, an anonymous attendee, Bruno Rios, and I wonder if I could send them to you afterwards, and we'll post them then on our discussion forum on our website. Would you be willing to take those additional questions? They're short.
Yes, although I'm not sure what to say to the gentleman who's described me as Modi-esque in the Q&A. I suspect that's a reference to my beard rather than my commitment to
Yeah, I don't think
any particular religion. Of course, I'm very happy to, and those who are interested can also track me down. I think most easily on Twitter, actually, where I am to be found with the handle Richard Gowan 1. And so few people want to talk about the UN these days that if anyone does want to talk to me about the UN, I'm usually very happy to do so.
Well, I think we do. And we do have a discussion forum just to carry on with the very questions. Are there any of those questions that you've looked at that you want to take a quick stab at? I mean, Arnold Sherman did ask one question, which is there some way to witness for the general public the forum, the future forum that Guterres is organizing for the end of next month?
Yes, this will be this will be televised on UN TV. I think it's, I mean, if you put in UN TV into Google, you will find that.
Yeah, sure.
Actually, yeah, most a surprisingly large number of UN meetings are televised, and the Summit of the Future will be televised. It will be 2 days of world leaders reading talking points. I wouldn't get too excited about this, but I think what you should look out for is the eventual Pact for the Future, which will also be available from the UN website, and that will tell you sort of what 193 countries are able to agree upon. In terms of other questions, someone asked, Charles Blomquist asked, can I describe the relationship the UN has with NATO, particularly in respect to Ukraine? The simple answer to that is that the UN has worked closely with NATO in some past cases, most notably in Kosovo, where you actually had a joint UN-NATO peacekeeping presence deployed after 1999, and then also in Afghanistan, where both the UN and NATO were involved in the international state-building effort. In those cases, cooperation was not always easy, but it was there. However, in the case of Ukraine, there is essentially no cooperation to speak of, because the UN is in Ukraine. The UN actually has a much larger humanitarian operation in Ukraine than is widely recognized. It doesn't get a lot of publicity because the Ukrainian government doesn't want to be seen as relying on handouts from the UN, which is entirely reasonable. And the UN was also involved in 2022 in negotiating the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the initiative that for a time allowed Ukraine to get its foodstuffs exported via Istanbul. But because of Russia's role in the Security Council, because of Russia's grip on the organization, the UN is not able to work with NATO. And Russia has actually used the Security Council as a space to criticize NATO for arming the Ukrainians, which is a criticism that quite a lot of non-Western countries also buy into, although in my view that's incorrect. Then I see, sorry, Robbie didn't quite. I wasn't clear on the financial issue. Robbie asks, is the US living up to its financial obligations or not? Just to put it in very simple terms, is the Biden administration earmarking money for the UN? Yes, that is not a problem. Is Congress approving money, and is money coming through from Washington to Washington to New York? No, because you don't have, because you have so much dysfunction in Congress over budgetary issues. The amount that the money that is coming from the US is well below what the US has earmarked for the UN, and so it is not a problem of commitment on the part of the administration. It is a problem of cash flow arising from internal US politics. I hope that's a bit more clear.
Yeah, Richard, thank you so much. It was a tour de horizon, as they say, and it doesn't look good, but it's better that we know exactly what's there and what's doable, what's not doable, what's up and what's down, and a lot is down right now, unfortunately. But I think our members are well and much better informed thanks to your presentation. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.